When the tide of war turned against Japan in 1943, the submarines were further modified to cope with harsh new realities, and here they served exceptionally well. Many I-boats, stripped of torpedoes and transformed into cargo carriers, smuggled supplies to island garrisons bypassed by the advancing Americans, and on their return voyages they served as hospital ships, bringing home the sick and the wounded. They were refitted as oil tankers at a time when, as a Japanese naval officer said, one drop of high-octane gasoline is as precious as a drop of human blood. In removing the I-boat's attack gear, the Japanese High Command tacitly admitted that the last chance for victory was slipping away. Survival alone had become the objective. Yet the crews who had served so gallantly in a lost cause were still unready to accept defeat. In 1944, several I-boats were modified anew. Their decks were rigged to carry huge torpedoes converted into self-annihilating submarines. Japan's undersea force included the Leviathans and the minnows of the submarine world. The smallest Japanese submarines were only 78.5 feet long and displaced a mere 46 tons. These two-man midgets had a range of only 100 miles, and since they had no generators to recharge their batteries, they were virtual self-annihilating craft. More than 100 were built during the war, but only a few of them saw action. Each of the three biggest Japanese submarines was 394 feet long and displaced 3,530 tons, roughly 800 tons more than the world's next largest boats, the French Surcouf and American Argonaut. The Japanese giants were equipped with a special breathing device also possessed by the latest German U-boats. Air tubes that could be extended to the surface enabled them to operate their 4 diesel engines while submerged. The fuel tanks held 500,000 gallons, enough to carry the submarines 30,000 miles, the longest range of any boat that fought in the war. A Midget submarine, one of the 5 that attacked Pearl Harbor, wallows in the surf on the east side of Oahu. She was fitted with a self-destruct mechanism, but it failed to work. About 40 of the large I-class submarines were equipped as aircraft carriers, with a small reconnaissance seaplane. The special planes had a top speed of approximately 150 miles per hour and a range of 550 miles. Their wings, floats, and fins were detachable, and the flaps and tail assemblage folded so that the plane could be stored on deck in a cylindrical hangar. The plane was usually assembled in the early morning hours for a reconnaissance mission at dawn, and then was hurled off the forward deck by a compressed air catapult. When the mission was completed, the pilot landed at sea at a prearranged rendezvous point and waited there for the submarine to arrive. The plane was hoisted aboard by a crane. Both the launching and the recovery process took nearly 1 hour, more if the sea was rough, and the operation was hazardous indeed, for during launching the submarine lay vulnerable to armed enemy patrol planes. At least one submarine, forced to dive by a sudden air attack, had to abandon her plane and its pilot. In August 1944, at a secret base on Otsujima in Japan's inland sea, more than 200 Japanese volunteers began learning to pilot a new secret one-way weapon, the Kaiten, a 54-foot-long torpedo with a small pilot's chamber, a periscope, and a 3,000-pound warhead. The addition of the pilot was supposed to guarantee a hit every time, but the Kaiten was bulky and difficult to control. A man needed 6 hands and eyes, recalled a trainee. The Kaiten pilot received a final estimate of the target's course and speed just prior to being launched from the deck of an I-class mother submarine. After a brief submerged run, he popped to the surface for a sighting and then barreled ahead at 40 knots to the target. In approximately 80 missions during the final 9 months of the war, Kaiten managed to sink only 3 United States ships. Besides the 80 men who died in self-annihilating missions, no fewer than 8 Kaiten-bearing I-boats were sunk en route to launch sites, eliminating more than 600 crewmen. The United States ship Narwhal was an old and obsolete submarine, unfit for the rigors and hazards of combat patrol. She had been built in the 1920s and could manage scarcely 16 knots surfaced and 6 knots submerged, far less than the newer fleet boats. What is more, she presented a fat and inviting target to submarine-destroying Japanese convoy escorts, for she displaced an enormous 2,700 tons and was about as maneuverable as a coal barge. Yet in November 1943, as she ploughed her way through the Mindanao Sea, the Narwhal was fulfilling a role for the United States Navy in which she excelled. The big old submarine was on a special mission to the Philippines as part of a remarkable operation known as Spyron for Spy Squadron. Though the Narwhal was armed, she had been pressed into service as a supply carrier for the Philippine guerrillas. Every square foot of unoccupied space in her ample interior was crammed with cargo, 92 tons of it, including radio sets, quinine and other medicines, clothing, carbines and cartridges. The Narwhal also carried a special passenger. He was Lieutenant Commander Charles Chick Parsons, an officer in the Naval Reserve who had been manager of a stevedore company in the Philippines. Taken prisoner after the fall of Manila, Parsons had persuaded his captors to treat him as a neutral on the ground that he had been filling in for the absent consul of Panama. He had been allowed to leave on the repatriation ship, the Gripsholm. Now, as the head of Spyron, he was back, commissioned by General Douglas MacArthur to organize, coordinate and supply the guerrillas. His task was to prepare for the American liberation of the Philippines, and even the matchbooks he brought ashore for the guerrillas were printed with MacArthur's famed promise, "I shall return." Most of the Narwhal's crew would much rather have been in a lean and deadly fleet boat, hunting and sinking enemy ships. As it happened, the mission of the Narwhal was anything but a milk run, and for the submariners craving action, it provided an almost fatal dose of excitement. The Narwhal was 18 days out of Brisbane on the way to Mindoro when she made a night surface contact with a Japanese tanker in the Mindanao Sea. By rights, the skipper, Frank D. Latter, should have ignored the tanker. His business was elsewhere. But Latter, like his crew, was yearning for combat. He executed an attack approach on the tanker and fired a spread of 4 torpedoes from his forward tubes. All 4 fish missed. At once the rash attack backfired, for the tanker was accompanied by 3 destroyer escorts, which Latter had overlooked in the dark, and now they came roaring down on the Narwhal. Latter took the huge submarine deep, and she lay there suffering as a fierce barrage of depth charges exploded all around. When the sound and fury died down, Latter took her up again, and there were the waiting escorts, driving at flank speed toward his surfaced boat. Desperate, Latter started to run for his life, the Narwhal's 4 diesels pounding heavily. The escorts pursued, firing star shells to illuminate their target and armor-piercing shells to sink it. Latter called for more speed. The engineering officer, a lieutenant named Plummer, grew worried about his overworked diesels and called the bridge. "Captain," he said, "if we don't slow down pretty soon, we are not going to have any engines left back here." Latter eyed the oncoming Japanese and replied, "If we slow down, we won't need those damn engines." Then, incredibly, the shell splashes gradually began to fall farther and farther behind the Narwhal's churning wake. The ancient tub was opening the range on the Japanese escorts. With vast relief, Latter realized that the escorts themselves had to be older vessels incapable of more than 15 to 16 knots. As the star shells faded into gloom, the United States skipper zigged his submarine off on a new course, and after an hour's frantic race, he at last managed to elude the enemy and back off the throttles of his overheated diesels. From then on, Latter stuck strictly to business. 2 days later, the Narwhal lay to at an appointed spot just off the coast of Mindoro. Soon a guerrilla sailing vessel, the Donna Juana Maru, came alongside and took off some supplies. A few days after that, the Narwhal put in at a place called Nasipit Harbour on the island of Mindanao. The guerrillas there were numerous and supremely confident that with the help of the supplies and weapons provided by the Narwhal, they could hold their own against the Japanese. In fact, their village band arrayed itself on shore, and in defiance of any Japanese who might have been patrolling nearby, serenaded the Narwhal with "Anchors Aweigh." Emptied of cargo, the submarine evacuated 32 refugees and then turned back toward Australia to load up for yet another Spyron mission. During the rest of the war, the Narwhal would undertake 8 more Spyron missions. On each trip, she played a deadly game of tag with Japanese patrol boats, and her crew never knew if her appointed rendezvous would be betrayed by an informer. It never was. As the many Philippine guerrilla forces grew toward a total of 250,000 men, so did their supply requirements. Other submarines were diverted from regular patrols to carry in American intelligence agents, coast watchers, radios, money, both genuine currency and counterfeit Japanese invasion scrip, ammunition and weapons, including bazookas, machine guns, and even light cannon. The radios smuggled ashore by the submarines helped the guerrillas and coast watchers set up more than 150 clandestine stations and report on Japanese shipping and troop movements all over the Philippines and adjacent waters. In all, 19 United States submarines undertook 42 Spyron missions with only one loss. That boat was the Seawolf, which in October 1944, while carrying 17 United States Army agents and about 10 tons of supplies to Samar in the central Philippines, was sunk by depth charges from the destroyer escort United States ship Narwhal after having been mistakenly bombed and marked by a Navy plane. The accomplishments of the Narwhal and her companion boats in the Spyron operation epitomized a wholly different aspect of the United States submarine campaign in the Pacific. Though the primary business of the undersea fleet was to sink enemy vessels, the very qualities that made the submarine a fearsome weapon, its stealth and long range, made it ideal for any number of exotic missions. These missions, for all their basically non-combat nature, were filled with risks of every sort. From the start, they called up uncommon courage and endurance from the crews, and any skipper who was not a master of improvisation when he set off on a special mission soon became practiced in the art. As the war progressed, the types of special missions assigned to United States submarines told much about the course of the fighting. At first, the submarines were hastily drafted for desperate errands, anything to stave off disaster. Later, as the fortunes of war shifted in favor of the United States, the special missions became large, confident, well-organized operations, performed by many boats that the Navy could easily spare from combat duty. Typical of the first phase, during the dark days of Japanese conquest, was the February 1942 mission of the Sea Dragon. She removed from Corregidor the personnel of a code-breaking unit whose capture might have compromised a major United States secret, that American cryptanalysts had broken one of the Japanese naval codes. Similarly, the Swordfish evacuated Philippine President Manuel Quezon, along with his family and several aides, and then went back to pick up United States High Commissioner Francis B. Sayre. During the retreat of General MacArthur's command to Australia, the Trout transported some 20 tons of Philippine gold and silver from Manila Banks to Pearl Harbor. Such makeshift missions continued well into 1942. But with the landing of the Marines on Guadalcanal that August, the United States took a tentative first step toward seizing the initiative in the Pacific. Thereafter, submarines were used with increasing aggressiveness to poke and probe into places where no surface ship had yet ventured. In carrying the war to the enemy, United States submarines transported small troop units to attack landings. They made close-in reconnaissance of hostile beaches, which were sometimes a considerable distance from the locations given on old charts. They developed a new art of periscope photography, bringing back detailed pictures of the terrain and defenses of future invasion targets. One of their most hazardous jobs was charting minefields before the arrival of the massed surface invasion fleets. And in their most satisfying special mission, the submariners reversed roles and became saviors instead of terminators, rescuing hundreds of Army, Navy, and Marine flyers who had been shot down or forced to ditch during attacks on Japanese strongholds. After Guadalcanal and the Solomons campaign came the invasion of Tarawa and other islands of the Gilbert Group in the autumn of 1943. For that operation, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious attack, wanted detailed photographic coverage of the invasion beaches. The job was given to the Nautilus, skippered by Commander William Irvin. At that point, a few submarine skippers had made dramatic pictures of sinkings through their periscopes. But reconnaissance photos of a beach, arranged in precise panoramic succession and showing such inconspicuous features as machine gun nests, called for a much more exacting technique. Moreover, the task was complicated by the periscope's tendency to vibrate and its inability to admit more than 35% of the ambient light. Camera brackets were built for the Nautilus's periscope. The lower sonar room was converted into a dark room. A Navy photographer was assigned and equipped with the 3 available cameras, a large view camera, a camera using medium-sized roll film, and a miniature camera using 35mm film. So armed, the big submarine set out from Pearl Harbor and headed for the Gilberts. But each of the cameras left a good deal to be desired. In the roll film camera, the rangefinder and the lens were separate. The camera could not, therefore, be accurately aimed through the periscope. The large size of the view camera made for awkward handling. The miniature's 35mm negatives turned out to be too small to be enlarged to the desired size without sacrificing the clarity of the image. The Nautilus's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Richard Lynch, had a better alternative. An enthusiastic amateur photographer, Lynch owned a single-lens reflex camera called a Primaflex, which took 2.25 by 2.25 pictures. Because it was a single-lens reflex, the photographer, aiming through the periscope, could see what the lens was looking at. Its size was convenient, and its negatives were larger than those of the miniature. As the Nautilus maneuvered from point to point along the Tarawa coast, the Navy photographer overlapped his shots by 50%. Each roll of 12 exposures was carefully coordinated with a chart of the island, giving the submarine's position and distance from the beach. The combined result was a detailed panorama of Tarawa's low-lying foreshore. Admiral Turner was delighted, and the Navy immediately launched a search for more Primaflex cameras. But the Primaflex was German-made and hard to come by. Eventually, advertisements in photographic trade magazines rounded up 10 second-hand duplicates of Lynch's camera, and thereafter every Japanese target island was painstakingly pre-surveyed by a German lens looking through the eye of an American submarine. On November 19, 1943, almost 2 months after that run to the Gilberts, the Nautilus was back off Tarawa on a special mission of a different sort. She was ordered to reconnoitre and report tide and surf conditions in advance of the marine attack the next morning. After that, she was to offload some passengers she had been carrying since leaving on patrol. They were 78 Marines of the Amphibious Reconnaissance Company of the 5th Amphibious Corps, and they were to be put ashore secretly to scout the small, lightly garrisoned island of Abemama, which was to be invaded after the fall of Tarawa and Makin. By about 10 p.m. on November 19th, the Nautilus had completed her tidal survey and was heading out with her Marines for Abemama. She was manoeuvring through shallow water to clear a reef when, with no warning except a radar contact that she had taken to be from friendly vessels, a salvo of shells came down on her. One of them hit under the bridge, pierced the main air induction, slammed into the conning tower and came to rest in the superstructure, all, providentially, without exploding. The dud was a 5-inch shell and had an American identification number on it. Skipper Irvin shot aloft a green recognition flare and, despite the fangs of coral in the water nearby, dived for the shallow bottom. A barrage of shells followed the Nautilus down. One shell burst, ruptured a waterline and started leaks in the bilges. With water also gushing through the hatch of the damaged conning tower, the submarine hung for hours at an awkward nose-down angle while damage control parties struggled to stanch her wounds. "We felt time was running out fast," Irvin later wrote in his patrol report. The 78 Marines we had aboard were stoic, but they were unanimous in the attitude that they would much prefer a rubber boat on a very hostile beach to their present predicament. By early morning on November 20th, the Nautilus was back on the surface and running for Abemama, where she landed the Marines that night. The island was as lightly defended as advertised, and on the following day the little party of leathernecks took it handily with the assistance of the Nautilus's 6-inch guns. And which United States ships had nearly done the Nautilus to death? The United States destroyer Ringgold reported that she had sunk a Japanese patrol boat in the area where the Nautilus had been sailing. The light cruiser Santa Fe claimed to have helped the destroyer. These allegations held up until the Nautilus reached Pearl Harbor and displayed the dud shell. It was subsequently mounted in the Officers' Club at the submarine base, as a reminder to the submariners that not even friendly warships could be entirely trusted. Late in the summer of 1943, shortly before the Tarawa invasion, there came into being the so-called Lifeguard League, which would become the largest of the special submarine operations. It was conceived when Rear Admiral Charles Apownall, planning carrier strikes on Marcus Island, the Gilberts and Wake, called in Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood to ask that submarines wait offshore from the targets as potential rescuers. Lockwood hesitated. He wanted to save flyers, of course, and he realized that the possibility of rescue would give the airmen a great boost in morale, but each rescue effort would expose a submarine and her whole crew to protracted risk. Submarines were as vulnerable as they were deadly. A boat's best protection against her enemies was to remain underwater, but rescue work meant staying on the surface in daylight, often within range of land-based enemy planes and sometimes under the guns of shore batteries. And then, as the Nautilus could attest, there was also the risk of accidental attack by friendly ships and planes. For all his qualms, Lockwood finally agreed to do lifeguarding duty provided that Admiral Nimitz would bless the project. Nimitz did, and Lockwood assigned his operations officer, Captain Richard G. Vogue, to work out the details. It was at once apparent that no rescue submarine was likely to do anybody much good unless the aviator in trouble knew where to look for it. The first step, therefore, was to assign a base position for the lifeguard on a certain bearing and distance from a recognizable landmark. At first, communications presented serious difficulties. In the air, the flyers chattered among themselves and to their carrier by two-way voice radio. But the submarines lacked such radios and spoke only in Morse code. Relaying all information through the carriers would cause delay and numberless possibilities for foul-ups, unacceptable in an emergency. The radio men of the submarine fleet solved that problem. They pointed out that the ordinary commercial very high-frequency receivers, mounted in the wardroom and crew's mess for entertainment, could be tuned to pick up the zoomies, as they called the flyers. Thus, a flyer who was about to ditch or his squadron mates could directly notify the lifeguard where to look. Each lifeguarding submarine was assigned a code name for the pilots to use that contained at least one letter L, on the decidedly shaky thesis that the Japanese could not pronounce the letter and could therefore be detected if they tried to contact a submarine using the code. The submarines on lifeguard duty had to accept such undignified noms de guerre as Lollipop, Lonesome Luke, and Lillian Russell. The first two lifeguard assignments, which stationed the Snook at Marcus and the Steelhead at Tarawa in the Gilberts, were abortive. Nobody got shot down. But at Wake Island on October 6th and 7th, Commander Eugene McKinney's Skate had a wildly exciting time. The Skate was waiting on the surface at her assigned position when the first waves of the carrier strikes came in before dawn. She was in a perfect position to enjoy a close-up view of one of the great shows of the Pacific War. Flares lighted the target in an eerie glow. The bombs began dropping and exploding in lurid bursts of fire. Flames boiled up from the target, reaching hundreds of feet in the air. Japanese anti-aircraft speckled the sky with fireworks. For submariners, accustomed to operating in darkness and isolation, it was an eye-filling spectacle, and its appeal led to trouble. There were a dozen men on the bridge and afterdeck when, rushing toward her first reported ditched flyer, the submarine was strafed by a low-flying Japanese Zero. McKinney yelled, "Clear the bridge!" and followed 11 men through the hatch, and then slammed it behind him. The Skate went under with bullets rattling off the conning tower. But as the boat dived deep, Lieutenant Junior Grade Willis E. Maxson III, the junior officer of the deck, collapsed in a heap. He had taken a bullet in the back and was unconscious. The Skate rescued no flyers that day. Instead, she was repeatedly driven under by Japanese planes. After reporting Maxson's condition to Pearl, McKinney received orders to rendezvous with a destroyer and transfer his wounded officer. The Skate ran through the night to the rendezvous point, but no destroyer appeared. Maxson by now had regained consciousness, and though he was in agonizing pain, the young officer asked McKinney to keep the submarine on the job. Another message from Lockwood ordered the Skate to remain at Wake until nightfall on October 7th, and then to take Maxson toward Midway at flank speed. Shortly after dawn of the second day, 4 United States dive bombers dropped down over the Skate, signaling that they were lost and unable to find Wake. The boat signaled back a bearing and the bombers went on their way. Around 9 a.m., the Skate received a bearing on a plane that had gone down with 2 flyers about 2 miles from the beach. The submarine headed for the spot, but 6 miles out she was driven under by heavy fire from big guns on shore. Submerged, McKinney pressed on slowly for 45 minutes. Then he surfaced again, holding the boat just barely awash with only the point of the bow and the bridge above water. He called for volunteers and sent 3 men wading up to the prow, ready to grab the 2 flyers as soon as they appeared. The Japanese shore battery was still firing, the shells hitting nearby, but strafing planes from the carriers kept working on the guns and finally silenced them. Moments later, the Skate made the Lifeguard League's first rescue. Lieutenant Harold J. Kicker was plucked out of a rubber raft. The second flyer, Ensign Murray H. Tyler, was afloat in a Mae West life jacket and was so exhausted that he could not swim to the submarine. So torpedo man Arthur G. Smith jumped over the bow with a life ring and brought in the flyer. Before the war ended, Tyler would be rescued by submarines on 3 different occasions. That night, with Maxson in urgent need of medical attention, McKinney drove the skate as hard as she could go toward Midway. But while the submarine was on the way, Lockwood received a report from the retiring task force. 9 more flyers were down somewhere around Wake. From Pearl, Lockwood made the agonizing decision to send the skate back for the flyers. As it happened, the decision made no difference. Maxson died around dawn on October 8th, hours before he could have received skilled medical care. McKinney later ordered the engines stopped. In a brief funeral service, Maxson's body was committed to the sea. The next morning, volunteer pickup men were on the bow again as the skate, awash and barely surfaced, crept through the seas near Wake. At one point, when an unidentified plane came in on the boat, the pickup men had to struggle back through deepening seawater to get inside before the skate dived. That day, the skate rescued 1 flyer. On October 10, she picked up 3 more. The last, Lieutenant Commander Marker Grant, an air group commander from the light carrier Cowpens, was found asleep in a rubber raft. He had been adrift for 4 days since the start of the battle, and in a vain attempt to secure a meal he had fired off nearly all of his pistol ammunition at circling Goonie birds. He brought back the single bullet he had saved for himself. From the carrier Lexington, some of whose flyers were among those saved, came a grateful signal. "Anything on the Lexington is yours for the asking. If it is too big to carry away, we will cut it up into small parts." No matter what precautions were taken to protect the lifeguards from friendly attacks, lectures, briefings, stern admonitions, precisely prescribed safety zones, there was always, as they said in the Navy, some stupid who did not get the word. The Tunny was one of 7 submarines sent to plug the entrances and exits from the Palaus, eastward from the Philippines, ahead of a series of carrier strikes at the end of March 1944. She had an exceptionally rewarding patrol before the carrier force arrived. She sank a Japanese submarine, the I-42, and even managed to get a fish into the 68,000-ton battle wagon Musashi. With a little more luck, the Tunny might have sunk, or at least stopped the Musashi, but lookouts aboard a destroyer escorting the battleship saw the spread of 6 torpedoes coming in time to give warning. The Musashi zigged and took the blow forward, where she was least vulnerable. With that, skipper John Scott turned the Tunny toward her lifeguard station 30 miles west of the Palaus to wait on the surface for calls to retrieve distressed aviators. She was there when a flight of 9 Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers passed to westward on their way to the target. 2 suddenly peeled off and began a run on the submarine. The first pilot realized in the middle of his run that he was making a mistake. He pulled up and flew away. But the second came on and dropped a 2,000-pound bomb that exploded only 30 feet to starboard of the submarine. The Tunny survived, but the explosion sprang leaks so serious that she was forced to abandon the lifeguard mission and go to Brisbane for repair and recrimination. As it turned out, more than a few submarines assigned to lifeguard duty would be the victims of misidentification, although not one was sunk. In spite of the ill treatment some submarines received from trigger-happy airborne compatriots, the crewmen repeatedly went to extraordinary lengths to save flyers. The Harder, Samuel Dealey's submarine, broke off her combat patrol to start lifeguard duty at the WWII atoll when Admiral Mark Mitcher's carriers struck there on April 1st. At 8:40 a.m., a Hellcat fighter came low, and by voice radio reported a flyer down and swimming toward the islet of Tagolap to the west of WWII. With fighters circling and zooming around the Harder to lead the way, Dealey ran west at full speed, all 4 diesels pounding furiously. Shortly before noon, a lookout spotted the pilot lying on the white sand beach inside the lagoon, and 1,500 yards beyond the surf-sprayed barrier reef. The pilot saw the submarine. He struggled to his feet with the aid of a stick and waved feebly. He was obviously far gone and in no condition to help himself. Dealey eased his boat shoreward. Before long she was in the shallows. The water was shoaling and the fathometer quit recording. A plane overhead reported what looked like an easier approach, and Dealey backed off. As Dealey watched, the stranded aviator fell and again lay stretched on the beach. His collapse, said Dealey's report, was undoubtedly due mainly to physical exhaustion, but also to the disappointment in seeing his chances of rescue apparently fade away. The alternative approach proved impractical, and Dealey returned to his original route. To hold the harder in place against the surf during the rescue operation, Dealey pushed the boat gently forward until her prow was grounded on the coral reef, and he gave orders to hold her there by keeping the engines running. It was daring seamanship. Even though the waters were relatively calm, Dealey ran the risk that some contrary current would swing the boat to port or starboard, to crash broadside onto the reef. Meanwhile, a plane had dropped a rubber raft on the beach in response to a plea that the flyer had managed to trace in the sand with his stick. He launched the raft and tried to paddle out toward the boat, but the tide was running against him, carrying him off in the opposite direction. At the same time, snipers hidden in the palms behind the beach began firing at both submarine and pilot. Overhead, the Hellcats began diving in to strafe the beach and keep the snipers down. Dealey called for volunteers and got more than he could conceivably use. His crew was by now committed to getting that man out, no matter what. Dealey picked 3 men and ordered a rubber boat launched. The volunteers went over the side and began swimming and pushing the boat across the lagoon, paying out a coil of light, strong line back to the submarine. It was slow, hard going. When they got far enough into the shallows to stand upright, they left one man to hold the boat, while the other 2 went in pursuit of the drifting flyer. Gingerly picking their way over the sharp coral, they finally reached the pilot in his rubber boat. But then came a foul-up. Just as they started hauling themselves rapidly back to the harbour, a well-intentioned United States pilot in a float plane from a cruiser appeared overhead and landed in the lagoon to see if there was anything he could do to help. In the process, he taxied across the lifeline and cut it. The 3 volunteers started laboriously swimming and pushing the rubber boat with the injured pilot back across the lagoon, still under occasional Japanese fire. Aboard the harbour, a 4th volunteer went over the side and swam toward the struggling rescuers, paying out another coil of line as he went. He reached them, and the line was lashed to the rubber boat. Amid gunfire from Japanese snipers, the line to the rubber boat was pulled to the submarine hand over hand. After everybody was safely on board, Dealey carefully backed the harbour down off her rocky perch and returned to his routine of sinking ships. His passenger, Ensign John R. Galvin from the Bunker Hill, remained aboard the harbour while Dealey sank a destroyer and a 7,000-ton freighter. As a consequence, aviator Galvin was awarded a treasured war decoration, the Submarine Combat Medal. Taking a proprietary interest in the life they had saved, the crewmen of the harbour kept close track of Galvin's career. When they learned he had shot down 7 Japanese planes, they figured that they shared in the victories. In its early days, lifeguarding was usually a piecemeal operation, seldom involving more than a single aviator or flight crew in need of help. But at Truk at the end of April 1944, the Tang went into business on a wholesale basis during massive strikes by land-based bombers and carrier planes. The submarine's assigned station was at a point 40 miles due south of Moen, one of the 3 largest islands in the huge lagoon of the Truk Atoll. This position left her 23 miles from the nearest point on the reef, and that was a matter of some distress to the Tang's skipper, Richard O'Kane, formerly the executive officer on Mush Morton's famed Wahoo. In order to rescue downed aviators, O'Kane thought, we belonged up front, as close as we could get. The Tang was on station before dawn. Carrier flights began arriving at daybreak, and the Tang was sent after a raft with a downed crew just off the southern face of the reef. The sight ahead would have brought a lump of pride to anyone's throat, O'Kane recalled later. Our bombers were peeling off through a hole in the clouds above Toll Island, a hole filled with flak and diving straight through. If they had that courage, we could at least get this survivor 2 miles off the beach. Guided to the raft by circling fighters, O'Kane took off 3 men with no great trouble. He sent them below for a shot of depth-charge medicine, Lijon brandy, and gave them a job helping the submarine's aviation information center. There they would be useful because they understood flyers' jargon, a language all its own, and knew many of the pilots by name and even by voice. The Tang had 2 more calls that day. One was for 2 men in a raft on the south side of Truk. but they were still inside the reef, inaccessible to the Tang. O'Kane reluctantly abandoned that effort, hoping the two could paddle across the reef during the night and be picked up the next day. The other summons was on behalf of a raft so far south of the atoll that the submarine did not reach the area before nightfall. The Tang spent the night zigzagging, firing green flares in hopes the flyers would respond. They did not. The aviators had seen the flares but dared not respond for fear of attracting Japanese attention. So far, it had been a disappointing mission. O'Kane had responded to 3 distress calls, with only 1 rescue. What is more, the Japanese at this point were well aware of the American boat's presence. O'Kane had already engaged in a brief gun duel with a Japanese position at the fringe of the reef while on his way to the second raft. Before dawn on May 1st, O'Kane and the Tang made contact with a Japanese RO-class submarine. O'Kane dived and tried to get into position for a torpedo shot, but the enemy submarine also dived, and she disappeared before O'Kane could engage. O'Kane sent a contact report to the United States flagship and then went back to lifeguarding, making sure to lash his boat's American flags on the deck fore and aft so no flyer would mistake him for the enemy. Around 8:30 a.m., the day's first call came in. 2 airmen were in a raft near the rescue point of the day before, perilously near the gun position on the reef. The Tang moved in and came upon an astonishingly crowded scene. The pilot of a Kingfisher floatplane from the battleship North Carolina had landed to help the castaway flyers, but had wrecked his plane in the process. A second Kingfisher had landed successfully and now began towing the raft, with its 2 occupants and the other Kingfisher pilot, toward the submarine. The 2 downed flyers were the same men whom the Tang had been unable to reach the day before because they were inside the reef. The Tang took the 3 men aboard, and the successful Kingfisher took off. It was flown by Lieutenant J.A. Burns, whom the Tang would soon meet again. Shortly thereafter, the submarine lookouts saw a torpedo plane trailing smoke and coming down. The Tang headed for it at flank speed, again passing the Japanese gun emplacement. Once more, O'Kane called up the crewman of his deck-mounted 4-inch gun, and they started blasting away to keep the Japanese quiet. The Tang took aboard 3 more guests, making 9. Another call sent the Tang racing toward the reef, where 3 rafts were now reported. Once again, Lieutenant Burns and his Kingfisher were there first. This time, the audacious pilot had collected 7 flyers, including the 2 who had been afraid to respond to the Tang's flares the night before. Now, with some of the men loaded onto his float and wings and with others in tow on their rafts, Burns was trying to taxi toward the submarine through a choppy sea. But before the Tang could make the pickup, a call came for still another flyer. This one downed in a narrow passage between the Truk Reef and that of a nearby island, Quop. Japanese troops were dangerously close at hand there, and O'Kane, deciding that Burns and his 7 guests were relatively safe, turned away and headed for the new contact. O'Kane expected to be driven under by nearby enemy gunfire, so on the way he ordered a towing bridle lashed to the radar mast. If necessary, he would try to tow the flyer's raft from the submerged boat. It was a technique the submariners had often discussed, but nobody knew if it would work. That contingency would have to wait another mission. By this time, the carrier task force had become gratefully aware of the perils faced by the Tang on behalf of the flyers. Now, wherever the submarine went, her private combat air patrol went along, strafing and bombing to keep the Japanese gunners from interfering. Said O'Kane later, "Never was a submarine better escorted. The Tang got her man." And he was no sooner aboard than O'Kane headed for a swimmer just off the eastern reef of Quop. The submarine arrived just in time. A plane had dropped a rubber boat to the swimmer, but the man had been too exhausted to clamber into it. With him aboard, O'Kane turned back to relieve Lieutenant Burns of his passengers on the Kingfisher. The aircraft was still afloat, but it was so battered by its day in the surf that it could no longer be flown. O'Kane loaded all hands, 9 men including Burns and his crewman, and sadly ordered the submarine's aftergun to destroy the little seaplane to keep it from falling into Japanese hands. The Tang was now crowded with 20 flyers, and more were to come. Another raft was soon reported south of the reef. Night was coming on, and O'Kane, mindful of the futile search the night before, was afraid he would miss the downed pilots in the gathering dusk. He called the task force and asked for help. In response, Admiral Midget sent aloft 3 night fighters, equipped with radar. Richard O'Kane later reported, "Tang slowed and we commenced a combing search downwind, the fighters now looking like black albatross as they flew their search patterns ahead and on our beams. Our chances of locating the raft seemed slim. Suddenly one of our fighters dived, firing red stars. The result was a shower of red very stars coming up from the sea, well ahead on our starboard bow. The fighters guided us in and were dismissed with thanks and Godspeed. The Tang found 2 more airmen in the raft, and so, at last, she headed home to Pearl Harbor carrying 22 flyers. After the exploits of the Tang and her sisters, it was amply evident to the Navy top command that lifeguarding was a godsend to carrier operations in enemy waters. But it was also obvious from the catch-as-catch-can early rescues that the techniques needed refinement. Starting in May 1944, a formal submarine combat air patrol was written into the operation orders for all carrier strikes. The submarine combat air patrol pilots had definite chores to perform, protecting the submarine by strafing and bombing coastal defense guns, shooting down enemy aircraft, warning off impetuous friendly pilots, finding downed flyers and leading the lifeguard to them. The submariners took kindly to this help and commonly referred to their submarine combat air patrol colleagues as our chickens. The Stingray had reason to be grateful for the prompt arrival of her submarine combat air patrol on the morning of June 12, 1944, outside Ep.4 Harbor at Guam. She was on the surface when a twin-engine Japanese bomber came out of nowhere and made a strafing run on the bridge. As machine gun bullets ricocheted off her hull, the Stingray dived, and the skipper, Sam Loomis Jr., waited for the bombs that were certain to come. When none did, Loomis raised the periscope and saw 3 submarine combat air patrol planes drive the bomber into the sea. Not long thereafter, the submarine repaid the favor. She picked up one of the submarine combat air patrol pilots who had been forced to ditch after his engine stopped while he was chasing the bomber. That afternoon, the Stingray picked up the 2-man crew of a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver that had crashed in Ep.4 Harbor, within a quarter-mile of anchored Japanese ships. A favoring wind and tide enabled the pair to put up their raft's sail and make their way from the harbor to the submarine. The next day, the Stingray herself boldly penetrated a shallow bay at Guam and performed the first rescue with a periscope tow, much the same technique O'Kane had prepared to use but had found unnecessary. The call came from waiting submarine combat air patrol fighters at 10:15 a.m. A pilot was down in the harbor, about 500 yards from shore, at a point where cliffs rose steeply from the beach to a plateau topped by a Japanese airstrip and a ring of anti-aircraft guns. Many of these had been destroyed in the first day's bombing, but at least one heavy gun was still firing. It now turned its attention to the Stingray as she raced into the harbor, and a shell splashed into the sea 400 yards to starboard. Loomis eased his boat down to periscope depth. He now made up his mind that if the rescue attempt was to work at all, it would have to be accomplished with a periscope tow. He could only hope the pilot had been briefed on the technique. If not, the poor fellow was likely to have a terrifying experience, seeing that up-thrust eye swimming straight at him like some sea monster. The flyer was in a rubber boat dropped to him by submarine combat air patrol. The anti-aircraft gunners were throwing an occasional shell at him. Loomis could see him ducking in his frail craft as though the air-filled donut could afford protection. Shells were still splashing near the Stingray, some within 200 yards. Loomis stayed at his periscope as the submarine made a dead slow approach. The flyer waved, and Loomis was close enough to see that he had suffered a deep cut across the palm of his left hand. For a moment, at 1:03 p.m., as Loomis later noted in the log, he thought that the Stingray had connected with her man. The pilot was so close that Loomis suddenly lost him in the scope's visual field, but then the pilot reappeared, and Loomis saw that they had missed. Loomis dared not reverse his engines. The Stingray had a tendency to broach when backing while submerged, and showing the hull could be fatal. It took Loomis 49 minutes to get into position for another try. After a last slow turn, he moved in on the pilot, but for some reason the flyer was frantically paddling away from the oncoming periscope. 1 hour later, Loomis tried again. This time the pilot seemed to make a grab for the periscope, but missed again. LM getting damned disgusted, plus a stiff neck and a blind eye, Loomis wrote in the log. Nevertheless, he decided to make one more attempt. At 3:16 p.m., the Stingray ran directly into the rubber boat, and this time the pilot got a rope around the periscope and held on. The submarine moved seaward at 2 knots. Even at that speed, Loomis could see through the periscope that his client was having an agonizing ride through the choppy harbour waters. The pilot was yelling, pleading to be taken aboard, but Loomis had no intention of surfacing within range of the gun, which was still planting shell bursts dangerously close. He ran for an hour and then lowered the periscope, breaking the pilot's tow line and cutting the rubber boat adrift. The man's face first showed alarm at being abandoned, and then beaming relief as the Stingray heaved up out of the sea. Picked up Ensign Donald Carroll Brandt, Loomis wrote in the log. To explain his strange behaviour during the approaches, Brandt said that he was afraid the periscopes were going to hit him, and he tried to get out of the way. It turned out that while the pilot had been briefed on a rescue like this, he had been pretty well shaken up while bailing out and had been in something of a daze for a while. He had somehow tangled himself up in his parachute harness and had fallen upside down from 12,000 feet. "We are on speaking terms now," wrote Loomis. "But after the third approach I was ready to make him captain of the head. Late in 1944, when Army B-29s began flying out of Saipan and Tinian in the Marianas to bomb Tokyo and other Japanese cities, lifeguarding became even more complicated. One of the difficulties was psychological. By and large, Navy pilots knew enough about submarines and the sea to be able to ditch promptly and effectively, and to cooperate in their own rescues. But to many Army airmen it was ridiculous to think of setting a plane down on the trackless waters, then clambering aboard a tin cigar and perhaps submerging in it, assuming it could ever find them. The Army flyers' every instinct was to stick with their damaged planes to the last, trying to nurse them back to dry land. The results of early arrangements were not highly successful, chiefly because of the aviators' desire to bring their ships home, Lockwood said. They always seemed to believe that they could pull through on a wing and a prayer, unless, of course, the aircraft was shot all to pieces. To overcome this reluctance to ditch and teach the airmen rescue techniques, Lockwood and the Bomber Command's boss, Major General Curtis E. LeMay, held a series of indoctrination sessions on Guam. Flyers who had been rescued by submarines assured their fellow B-29 crewmen that the boats were indeed capable of getting them home in one piece. Some aviators accepted invitations to go out on training cruises in the boats. A few submariners even flew in the big bombers. To upgrade air-sea communication, all Lifeguard submarines were now equipped with two-way very high-frequency voice radio, so that the submariners could talk directly to pilots aloft. More precise aerial navigation was emphasized to improve the accuracy of the flyers' position reports to the submarines in case they were forced to ditch. New tools were also added to increase the versatility of the air-sea rescue operation. The Navy assigned a number of patrol bomber, Martin Mariners and PBY Catalinas to conduct search and rescue operations. These went under the code name of Dumbos, and until the United States Marines won their fierce battle for Iwo Jima in March of 1945, these slow, poorly armed planes operated only to the south of that island. To fly search missions over the more dangerous waters closer to Japan, the Air Force contributed Super Dumbos, B-17s and B-29s, powerful enough to take care of themselves in a fight, and long-legged enough to stay aloft for 9 and 14 hours respectively. The Dumbos and Super Dumbos carried cargoes of emergency equipment, life rafts equipped with aluminum targets that would register on a submarine's radar, and hand-cranked Gibson Girl radio transmitters. The Super Dumbos even carried motorboats that could be dropped from the air. But the main job, that of retrieving airmen from the sea, still fell to the submarines, and they became marvellously expert at the job. In February 1945, submarines rescued nearly 50% of all the men who went down at sea in B-29s. By then, there were few places where American submarines dared not go, and in that same February, the Pomfret, under John B. Hess, crept to within 25 miles of Tokyo itself to pluck airmen from the sea. The Pomfret's feat was a byproduct of a carrier raid on Japan, launched in support of the Iwo Jima invasion. Having already taken part in an 8-submarine sweep to clear the seas ahead of the striking force, the Pomfret, on February 16, took Lifeguard station off a lighthouse at the entrance to the Sagami Sea, the waters leading into Tokyo Bay. The weather was brutal. Snow, freezing rain, and a sea that kept the surfaced submarine pitching and rolling so violently that it was almost impossible to maintain footing on the bridge. Ironically, the Pomfret's first rescue of the day was a Japanese pilot picked up from a wildly tossing life raft. At first, the flyer took off his life jacket and tried to drown himself. Finally, he allowed himself to be hauled aboard. Given a potion of brandy, he downed it through chattering teeth and spoke one word in English. "More!" Just before dark, the weather cleared enough for submarine combat air patrol planes to lead the Pomfret to an American flyer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph P. Farrell. That rescue concluded the first day's business. The summons to higher adventure came just after noon on the second day. A flyer was reported in the drink far up the Sagami Sea, an area close to the Yokosuka Naval Base, and framed on three sides by Japanese air bases and shoregun installations. The Pomfret's lookouts could not see the land. A thick surface haze blotted out the view, but they saw waves of United States fighter bombers passing only a few hundred feet overhead, and they heard the crump of bombs falling on Yokosuka. Navigating by radar and radioed directions from friendly fighters, John Hess drove his boat closer and closer to the unseen land. His plight grew palpably worse when the submarine combat air patrol pilots told him they were nearly out of fuel and would soon have to retire. One by one they turned back, until Hess was left with only one tenacious escort, which stayed in the vicinity until the Pomfret picked up Ensign R.L. Buchanan, a fighter pilot. Hess later recalled, "The moment Buchanan was aboard, the lone pilot overhead dipped his wings, said, 'Congratulations on a wonderful job, well done,' and left in haste since he was not sure he had enough gas left to get back himself. I hope he had not miscalculated." The Pomfret ran out as fast as the turbulent sea would permit. On the way, her lookouts spotted one more castaway, a pudgy Japanese clinging to a swamped boat. He came aboard with alacrity, was assigned as a cook's helper, and was nicknamed Butterball. By the time the Pomfret reached base, Butterball had learned to sing a fair rendition of "God Bless America." The submarine rescue rate continued to climb. For the month of May 1945, the boats saved an amazing 80% of all ditched bomber crews, and that month saw the start of perhaps the most fruitful sea rescue mission by a single submarine. In the early afternoon of May 26th, off the east coast of Honshu, the Tigrone picked up a distress call from a Navy twin-engine bomber. The pilot reported that he had lost an engine and also his own whereabouts. The Tigrone's skipper, Hiram Cassidy, asked if the pilot could see land. The reply was no. Cassidy told the pilot to fly straight west until he saw the coast of Japan and then describe what he saw. Cassidy went to his own charts and identified the lost plane's location. He gave the pilot a course to the Tigrone. Nearly an hour later, the crippled aircraft ditched just to starboard of the submarine's bow. Within minutes, the five-man crew was safe aboard. 4 days later, another call took the Tigrone to a crippled PBY Catalina, itself on air-sea rescue duty. The seaplane had landed and picked up 9 men from a ditched B-29, but while the plane was trying to take off, the prop on the left engine had broken and ripped through the pilot's compartment, gravely injuring Lieutenant Royal Stratton. Cassidy manoeuvred alongside and took off everybody before sinking the cripple with gunfire. With the 7-man crew of the PBY and the 9 from the B-29, the Tigrone's guest list was now up to 21. Cassidy sent an emergency call for a destroyer to take off the injured pilot, but before the Tigrone could make the rendezvous, Stratton died. That night the weather turned nasty, the sea marching past in waves reaching 30 feet from trough to crest. To make the Tigrone manageable, Cassidy took her down to 100 feet. At dawn, despite a still turbulent ocean, he surfaced and consigned to the sea the body of Lieutenant Stratton. Towards sunset that evening, a PBY Dumbo reported that it was circling a raft carrying part of the crew of a ditched B-29. When the Tigrone reached the scene, the wind had abated, but the seas were still high, making it difficult to put the submarine alongside the raft. To make matters worse, the castaways, who had been adrift throughout the storm of the night before and had repeatedly been washed overboard, were by now too exhausted to assist in their own rescue. Finally, the submarine passed close to the raft, and one of the Tigrone's officers, Lieutenant H.D. Ragg, jumped aboard. He succeeded in securing the raft to the submarine. The 7 new arrivals brought the number of those rescued by the Tigrone to 28. Before the submarine reached Guam on July 3, she had rescued 2 more flyers for a final total of 30, the highest total run up by any submarine on a single sea rescue patrol. All told, the American submarines saved 504 flyers, including a few British and Australians. Of course, lifeguarding on this grander scale would not have been possible in the face of strong Japanese opposition. To the strategic planners, it was quite obvious as early as February of 1944 that Japan was weakening rapidly. And for this deterioration in enemy strength, the United States owed much to the destructive work of the submarines. An hour out of Fremantle on May 26, 1944, skipper Samuel D. Dealey of the Harder broke the seal on his orders and briefed his men on their special mission. They were to creep into shore on Borneo and, with a pair of collapsible kayaks, evacuate 6 Australian intelligence agents who had been sabotaging oil refineries and inciting local resistance to Japanese occupation. Said Dealey, "I'll suggest we make the first try a success. I do not like hanging around in shallow water. Shallow water, too shallow to hide a submarine from the eyes and bombs of enemy pilots, was only one of the dangers that United States submarines faced in their remarkable assortment of special missions. There were Japanese patrol boats, some of which almost sank the Trout as she probed into Ilana Bay to deliver supplies to Philippine guerrillas. There were coastal batteries. The Redfin ran a gauntlet of them to rescue ambushed crewmen who had gone to fetch some spies. Enemy depth charges were a particular horror in confined waters near land, as the Narwhal found out in the Philippines while fleeing 2 destroyers that had caught her smuggling underground leaders ashore. Enemy snipers and gunfire from trigger-happy friendly aircraft also imperiled many submarines as they rescued downed airmen and civilian refugees behind enemy lines. Yet time and again, the submarines ran their risks and survived. Among their many accomplishments in the course of the war, they delivered 1,300 tons of supplies to the Philippine guerrillas and ran 14 photographic reconnaissance patrols to find paths of least resistance for future invasions. The skippers who excelled in these missions owed their success to steady nerves, sound judgment and plain luck, all of which Dealey had in ample measure on his trip to Borneo. He picked up the 6 agents without a hitch on June 8th, but then ran into trouble. Before the Harder reached Fremantle, Dealey brought her through 2 depth-charge attacks, a heavy bombing and the tremendous explosion, only 80 feet overhead of a destroyer he had just torpedoed. Such was the buffeting that a rescued Australian said glumly, "I would rather be back in Borneo. It was a nerve-wracking task to photograph an enemy-held shoreline for United States invasion planners. Virtually every submarine that undertook a photo reconnaissance mission was harried by coastal patrol boats or sent diving by enemy aircraft. The Spearfish was chased by a submarine near Iwo Jima. The Greenling spent anxious days off Guam before she finally shook a motorized sampan whose captain was both a clever and a determined man. It is apparent that he has no sound gear," reported the skipper of the Greenling. "He must follow the birds which are always hovering over us. Yet for all the danger, only 1 submarine failed to return from a photographing mission. She was the Swordfish, sent on December 22, 1944, to reconnoitre the shore defences at Okinawa. Though the Navy never pinpointed the cause of her loss, officials concluded that she was sunk by depth charges or a coastal mine. To reduce the risky picture-taking time, the Periscope photographers and the submarine crews worked hard to refine their techniques. Cyrus C. Cole, the skipper of the Spearfish, drilled his 7-man photographic team so thoroughly on the way to Iwo Jima that they could raise the periscope the necessary 4 feet above the water, shoot a 12-exposure panorama, and lower the scope in less than 40 seconds. Each submarine carried at least 2 cameras so that one could be reloaded while the other was in use. Unfortunately, the cameras the Americans used for periscope photography were subject to breakdowns, and on-the-spot repairs had to be improvised. T.W. Miller, the engineer on the Greenling, solved one problem during a recon mission off Saipan. Miller carefully took apart a bulky camera and discovered that the function of the shutter was impaired by the high humidity of the submarine's interior. He cleaned and oiled the shutter parts, Then he dried them in an improvised oven at low heat. Thereafter, the cameras worked without fail and were stored in the oven until they were needed. As the Trout headed home to Pearl Harbor after a special mission in February 1942, her unlikely cargo rivaled that of a Spanish treasure galleon. Below her Spartan deck was stowed part of the national treasury of the Philippines, some 20 tons of gold and silver worth more than $25 million. The Trout had not made the trip to collect treasure. She had been dispatched to deliver 3,500 anti-aircraft shells to Corregidor for General Douglas MacArthur's beleaguered garrison. But with that task completed, someone suggested that she take back the Philippine treasure, which had just recently been transferred from Manila. Loading all of the gold and silver took the whole night. Working furiously against time, at daylight the submarine would have to submerge to hide from enemy bombers. The crewmen passed the gold bars and bags of silver coins into the boat. Some of the bags, rotted by years of storage in Manila bank vaults, burst open and sent coins clattering over the dock and plinking into the water. At sunrise, with shells exploding over nearby Bataan, the Trout submerged. She waited until dusk, then slipped out to sea. And, wholly undeterred by the enormous value of her cargo, she attacked and sank 2 Japanese ships before arriving safely at Pearl Harbor. Except for the advantage of underwater stealth, a submarine was ill-suited to her special role as troop transport in amphibious landings on Japanese territory. The cramped interior of a boat could accommodate at most 120 troops, and no landing craft more substantial than inflatable dinghies. The submarine's hatches were so tight, 25 inches in diameter, that big men wearing their battle gear could not fit through them, and the narrow deck made it difficult to mass the landing party for quick disembarkation. Nevertheless, submarines landed several attack forces for successful attacks. One of the trickiest was a diversionary raid on Attu in the Aleutian Islands in May 1943. The Nautilus and the Narwhal arrived offshore with 215 soldiers of the Provisional Scout Battalion formed for this operation. Their job was to draw Japanese troops away from a main invasion beach 7 miles distant and to prevent them from escaping into the mountains. 3 times the attack had been postponed by blustery snowstorms and hazardous surf, and even on the night of the landing a blanket of fog made it difficult for the submarines to maneuver. As the raiders began to leave the Narwhal, skipper Frank D. Latter warned them that if enemy ships appeared, the boat would dive instantly, no matter how many of them had taken to the dinghies. But the men had rehearsed their disembarkation many times, and now the practice paid off. No Japanese ship appeared, and all the dinghies were loaded smoothly. Then the attack leader signaled the submarine, and she slipped underwater. The raid itself was successful, but costly. The attack troops, including 165 more scouts who were landed by destroyer to back up those landed by the submarines, lost 11 men dead and 20 wounded, not counting some 300 frostbite cases. But they did manage to distract the Japanese long enough for the main invasion force to gain the beachhead. In fact, the raiders caused such a commotion that one of the defenders insisted that enemy strength must be a division. Battered by Japanese depth charges, the United States submarine Naval limped into her base at Fremantle, Australia, on May 28, 1944. Her skipper, Lieutenant Commander Frank D. Walker, Jr., reported more than 50 items in need of repair, among them a malfunctioning diesel engine, 2 smashed periscopes, ruined radar gear, a broken compass, and assorted leaks that flooded the bilges. Walker's squadron commander noted on his status report, "Naval will require longer than the normal refit period," and put her in the care of the submarine tender Orion. Such were the challenges that faced the refit teams when the boats returned from patrol. As soon as a combat-weary crew came ashore, bound for hotels, beaches, and beer halls, technicians swarmed over the boat, repairing the items on the weep list. If necessary, the submarine was popped into a floating dry dock, where maintenance crew replaced chipped propellers, overhauled torpedo tubes, and scraped the hull clean of barnacles and seaweed. Repair work ceased and began only after the skipper had inspected the whole boat and pronounced himself satisfied. As the undersea war kept closer to Japan, the submarine's journey for refit at their original bases became inconveniently long. Tenders solved the problem by serving as the advance bases at the Western Pacific Islands. Each of the 400-foot motherships bulged with machine shops, spare parts stockrooms, optical shops for periscope work, foundries, living quarters for more than 500 men, and stores of food, diesel oil, ammunition and medical supplies for the squadron of 12 to 18 boats assigned to it. The high quality of the tender's work prompted the commander of the Southwest Pacific Submarine Fleet, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, to call them the heart and soul of all submarine squadrons,